Our service today is on jury duty, the importance of it to our country's pursuit of justice, and the impact on the jurors. Justice fits well into our theme of revolution, and I wrote an article in the December newsletter, Fishing for Your Jury Duty Experiences. Several of you reached out to me. Thank you. I'm going to offer some of my thoughts about jury duty, tell you about an experience of one of our congregation members that I interviewed, and then we'll hear from Judy, Stephanie, and Marcia. The justice system is broad. We hear mostly about police. We're learning about bail reform. We are sometimes reminded that a rich, guilty person fares better than a poor, innocent person. We watch courtroom dramas that mostly include detailed evidence, forensics, and the neatly summarized confession in the end. This drama isn't reality. We need thinkers. We need peers as jurors. We need you. And don't think this is just about service. Because the truth is, most people I know have done something that could easily land them in court. For example, driving under the influence or texting while driving, or simply making a mistake while driving that leads to a crash. And what about your family members? They could be in need of an objective jury. And the millions of people that are in the court system that you don't know directly, but affect our society. Today, I'm focusing on jury duty, which is one important part of a larger criminal justice system. Here's where you can raise your hand and no one will see you. How many of you have faced criminal charges? How many of you have loved ones who have faced criminal charges? Who has been involved in a civil lawsuit? When these cases go to a jury, who do you want on the jury? Who has received a jury summons in the mail? Who has called in or shown up for jury duty? Who has served on a jury? At the heart of the USA is democracy, liberty, and justice. Here's where I acknowledge that it is an imperfect system, and these ideals have never been fully realized, especially for those that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women. But we all know it is foundational to our country. There are two elements that are sacred and needed from the citizens: voting and serving on a jury. One gets a lot of attention, the other gets little. And most of that attention is complaints, and rarely put in the context of liberty and justice. For many years, I have been angered every time I hear someone exude negativity about jury duty. How do they not see the value of jury duty? Or is it an example of trying to belong and bond by complaining without thinking of the consequences? As I listen and read, I learn about the racial disparities of education, access to good jobs, housing, criminal justice, etc. And we know from the data and stories that Black Americans face much harsher outcomes in the US judicial system. That's systemic racism. There's several reasons for that, and one is that a jury of their peers is often elusive and continues today. Keeping women and people of color off of juries was codified in law for much of our history. Under English common law, which was the basis for early American law, women were deemed unfit to serve on juries under the doctrine of defective sex. Enslaved people were not allowed on juries. During Reconstruction, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to eliminate racial discrimination in jury selection. But soon, Jim Crow and Black Code laws overrode the act. The Supreme Court, in an 1879 decision, confirmed that a state may constitutionally confine the selection of jurors to males. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 gave women the right to serve on federal juries, but it wasn't until 1973 that all 50 states passed similar legislation. Let's address some of the common complaints of jury duty. It's inconvenient. You have to make an effort, call, show up. You know that you may have to miss work, and few of us have time for that. They didn't even need me and sent me home. There's a lot of waiting around. Yet, how much time do you spend voting over the years? Why is that time respected, but not jury service time? In the court system, there are logistics involved. Contingencies need to be planned for. The jury pool for the day needs to be large enough. It's an administrative process, which in general isn't something that gets respect. So here's my hope. Please be patient and understanding. It would be great if everything worked just in time, but it doesn't. As Stephanie told me, it's a very human experience. Another complaint, the pay is dismal, but many salaried people get paid by their employers. But those that don't, yes, that is a real concern. And missing a couple hours, days, or weeks from a job can be a real hardship. In my mind, the pay is to cover expenses such as travel and meals. I wonder if the citizenship of jury duty would have been more respected if it wasn't paid, as voting isn't paid. There are ideas out there to make it easier for more equality on a jury. What would our ideas of liberty and justice and the outcomes look like if we didn't have juries, only judges? What would it look like if the preponderance of juries were well-off Americans? Think of Congress and the presidents. What if you couldn't have peers or had only one peer on your jury? What if part of your identity wasn't represented? Race, sex, similar neighborhood, religion, education? Despite the common lore that jury duty is a miserable experience, that isn't what I hear from people who have served on a jury. I have not yet had the privilege. I noticed that people from my jobs who have served on juries wanted to talk about it. I listened and realized that the myth of rotten jury duty is false. They were impacted. They were interested. They felt important. They learned about our system, good and bad. One coworker was disappointed that just before they were to start deliberating, the defendant and the county struck a plea bargain and the jury's service was no longer needed. A friend of mine told me of her story serving on an emotionally difficult case and pointed out to me that there's a bit of thought that should be given after the trial before deciding what to go around town telling people of the details of our community members. Consider respect to be given to the victims, defendant, and families. I interviewed 4 of our congregation members. You'll hear from Judy, Stephanie, and Marcia. First, I'm going to tell you what another member of our church shared with me. I won't use their name in case I get some interpretation wrong, as I don't want to put words in their mouth that don't belong. Their experience was in the late 1980s, and they are haunted by it. The case was of a senior at Western Michigan University who was charged under a Michigan crack cocaine law, where 650 grams was the threshold to make it a very serious felony. The defendant, who was Black and from the east side of the state, was charged with possession of 666 grams of crack cocaine. That's 16 grams over the threshold. The potential jurors were told conviction could carry a harsh penalty. The trial lasted a month, but not every day. The jury included 2 Black jurists out of the 14. 2 of 14 were alternates that did not deliberate. The defense lawyer didn't seem prepared or wasn't very good. The defendant's parents were in court every day. The defendant didn't have a criminal record and was a good student with positive activities outside of academics. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. During my interview with our congregant, they told me when they were still a potential juror, they thought the law seemed extreme, but as a good citizen, they should do it because somebody needed to, and they agreed to go exactly by the rules, follow the law, and weigh the evidence. Despite not approving of the law, they felt they could be objective and were morally and psychologically covered. They, as a white person, had a career that included many interactions with people of different races. but this made them more aware of the reality that Black people in the community were living lives that were different from anything they had experienced despite growing up poor. The more the trial went on, the more bothered they became. Afterwards, they didn't want to think about the case. One of the white jurors was willing to ignore the evidence and thought the police may have framed the defendant, especially because the amount of crack cocaine was just a bit over the threshold. The other 11 jurors reminded him that all went in knowing the law existed, swearing to uphold the law, and if he really felt he couldn't be objective, he should have admitted his prejudice at selection. After some time, they changed his mind, and the defendant was found guilty. The experience was an eye-opener, and our congregation member became more outspoken for the Black community and laws and penalties that were passed specifically targeting oppressed communities. It also further cemented the connection between voting, laws, policies, and consequences. Later, the Michigan law was reformed in 1998 and removed in 2018. Next, we'll hear from Judy and her experience with jury duty.
Good morning. Like Kimberly, and I'm guessing many of you, I had always been willing, even eager, to serve as a juror, but had not been called until about age 60. The first 2 invitations did not pan out. A bunch of us in the jury pool waited at the courthouse for several hours, and then we were told that all of the jurors and alternates had been chosen, and we were free to go. Having had only TV and movie trial exposure, I was curious about the process and wondered about how much the average citizen really understood about the basic principles of our trial system. How well informed was I? Did our local system function fairly in the jury selection process? Finally, my turn came to experience our courts personally. While I don't remember a lot of little details, I very much remember the outcome of the trial and how I felt about it. The case was a felony charge involving theft from someone's home, possibly even breaking in. And I remember that both parties were Black males of limited means, and I'm guessing no advanced education. The jury included men and women, both Black and white, was most white men, but there are only 12 jurors, so I was satisfied. I have no memory of carrying the case overnight, so I believe that it was completed that day. Hearing the testimonies as the case proceeded, I began to worry. It seemed to me that neither attorney was fully prepared, that their facts were vague, and language was used that invited reliance on stereotypes. The judge was professional and instructed us well, but I feared that justice would not be served. My own preconceived notions about the average Joe or Judy juror were challenged during the deliberation process. After a bit of awkwardness as a leader emerged and getting a feel for each other, we were able to get off square one and consider the charges and the evidence. In what seemed a remarkably short period of time, we came to unanimous agreement, as I remember it, about 3 things. 1, our guts told us that the defendant was probably guilty. 2, the case for guilt had not been made effectively. And for that matter, 3, both the prosecution and defense attorneys had done D- work for their clients and for our justice system on that day. As we in the jury prepared to present our verdict of not guilty, we felt strongly enough to draft a letter to the judge about what we had witnessed, and to request a brief meeting with him after the trial. Our request was granted. There were no histrionics, no demands. A single spokesperson expressed the concerns that had generated the letter. We were heard, thanked, and dismissed. I went home that day with serious doubts about the quality of legal work that we require of our public servants and what we provide for our citizens who are neither affluent nor connected. But my heart was full of pride for the insight and the sense of justice I found in my fellow jurors. That part of the system had worked on that day, and I was glad to have taken part and to have witnessed it. Thank you.
Good morning. Since about the late 1990s, I have been called for jury service, I believe 5 or 6 times. And I was privileged to be, I think the word is impaneled, or at least got to the point where I and 12 or 13 or 14 others were seated and then questioned by the respective prosecutor and defense attorneys. The first time I was seated was probably maybe early 2000s. And as it happened, it was a criminal trial for rape. And when my turn came, I was asked if I could be an impartial juror. I said no. At some point, I went into the judge's chamber with the prosecutor and the defense attorney and the judge. And I repeated again that I was sure that I could not serve without prejudice. Everyone was very professional and seemed to be understanding. And I was dismissed. And driving home, I was more emotionally shaken than I realized. I almost went through a red light in downtown Kalamazoo. I think I probably took the afternoon off work that day. And since then, I've thought every now and then about that case and wondered if I should have at least attempted. And every time I have felt that no, it was the right thing to leave, because it was just a very instinctual, deep gut feel that I could not serve fairly. So the second time I was called, the second time I was seated, I don't remember much of the details. It was probably about 2005, 2006. And I don't think it was criminal. I think it was civil, but minor infractions, if you will. I mean, nothing like murder or rape or even breaking and entering. The defendant was a Black man, probably late 50s. His attorney seemed to be pretty well prepared, and so was the prosecution, as I recall. There were 2 charges, and honestly, I wish I could remember, but I don't remember what they were. Again, nothing involving serious harm or injury to anyone else, but definitely violations of law. So the trial was one day, started in the morning. We had a break for lunch. I remember going across the street to eat and then coming back. We heard the various witnesses, of course, including the arresting police officers. And I remember the address of the defendant. And about 2 weeks after I talked with Kimberly, I happened to be on that street and looked at the house again, and felt good that what the jury decided was what we decided. The jury conferred for probably about, it was under 2 hours. When we were in the room, one of the people volunteered to be foreman. My recall is that the majority of us were women. I think all of us were white, and there were probably 3 or 4 men. We took each charge, discussed the relevant facts. There was some clarification by 2 or 3 of us on various points. And we decided that the defendant was guilty on that particular charge. Then we took up the second one. And again, the same type of thing. There was input from most of the jury members, as I recall. And at the end of that discussion, we decided that the defendant was not guilty. And I think that this was probably, maybe 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we went back into the courtroom, and the foreperson announced not guilty on one and guilty on another, and we were dismissed. Overall, I found it a very positive, reaffirming experience. I don't know what sentence the defendant was given, but I didn't expect that it would be anything severe, and hopefully that was the case. So all in all, I'm very appreciative of the system. I'm glad that it was not a very serious case. I wish that there had been more diversity in our particular jury, but it was not. And I would do it again. Thank you.